So, hello everybody, good evening. Thanks for joining us. We're here to celebrate this fabulous new publication with three of the five authors. In addition to Mark Bashofsky, Bob Snyder, and Peter Schiffman, Eldridge and Judy Moores played a huge role in this, in the making of this book, and Bob will talk a little bit more about those two. But they were some of the early pioneers for geological tours through what's now the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. So we're very excited to take you on an adventure tonight with three of the authors. And I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to introduce Bob Snyder. He's going to start, and then Peter Schiffman's going to go second, and then Mark will go third. So Bob graduated from UC Davis with a degree in geology many moons ago. And after that experience, he spent a life protecting public lands, including places like Redwood National and State Park, and also the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. And he is married with two grown kids. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you start this together.
Yeah. Can you see my slide, Michael?
You need to share now. So
yeah, I'm
don't
trying
forget
to, but I can't get back to the, I'm trying to figure out how to get back to the, I just got that slide on here and I can't, I'm sorry, and I can't get back to the
That's okay.
main screen.
Go to the share screen, scroll down, and in the little pop-up control bar should
my
come.
thing won't scroll down. I'm sort of, it seems like I'm locked into the,
It's okay. I'll just assure everyone we practiced this before we started. So
I know,
Bob's
but
going to be.
I can't get out of this right now. How am I going to do this?
Minimize your PowerPoint and then come back to the Zoom page.
Yeah, well, I can't get off the screen. All I see on my computer, I've had this, because all I see is the, I'm sorry, folks. I don't know, without rebooting, if I can get off this slide show. My slide shows up on my screen, Michael. I just can't get it.
Oh, hit escape. All you got to do is hit escape.
All right.
Yeah.
There I go.
And then minimize that, and then you should go back to Zoom and hit the share screen button.
All right, now I'm on the share screen button, and I'm going to share this slideshow. And now
there you go.
Slideshow up, and there we go. Let me get back to slide one. There we go, folks. Sorry. So hello. This book's the story of geology, nature, and history of the Berryessa region at the southern end of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. It is particularly timely as we rush to finish in time for the 5th anniversary of the National Monument dedicated by President Barack Obama on July 10th, 2015. It was created for plate tectonics, biological diversity, wildlife migratory corridors, and recreational opportunities, including hiking, camping, birding, fishing, botany, mountain bicycling, horse riding, managed off-highway vehicles, and more. We are pleased that this is the first interpretive guide about the monument accessible to the public. This cover is by Obi Kaufman, a writer, naturalist, and illustrator. It combines science and art and is symbolic in how Eldridge Moores, to whom we dedicate this book, brought together both geology and cello playing in his life. They go together. And I think that's a strong message from Eldridge and Judy of how they conducted their lives and why, one of the reasons really they were humble and quite successful. The book's authors are Judy Moores, Peter Schiffman, Eldridge Moores, Mark Bashofsky, and myself. And we had a great team. Amy Boyer edited the text, and Tim Mesnick did great work on the illustrations. Allison Pokolimba did the layout, and we had many expert reviewers, although of course any and all mistakes are purely the work of the authors. Backcountry Press, Michael and Allison were wonderful to work with. The book was inspired by the two tours that Judy and Eldridge led in the region for many years, often to benefit local nonprofits. This image, oh, I forgot to flip the image here, folks. There's the authors, Judy and Peter and Eldridge and Mark on the far right. This image was taken at the end of the Springs Road, which is near the end of the one way of the tour, and on our first excursion together when we began this process in March 2018. I get emotional just seeing Eldridge in this slide. Native Americans first came to this region 14 or 15,000 years ago, although John Parker, an archaeologist up at Clear Lake, dated a piece that he says was from Borax Lake area that he dated at 20,000 years. So there's a little anomaly, but it's kind of interesting. The Native Americans knew this place. More recently, ranchers, miners, and farmers arrived. And most recently, folks have explored and studied the region for educational, scientific, and recreational purposes. Many groups are listed on the slide, sort of in the order that they arrived and began their work. Except for the historical societies, they've been around a lot longer. For me, Gary Snyder and Dave Robertson stand out for their discussion of a sense of place, a concept that I feel is critical in building sustainability on the landscape. Others of particular note included Susan Harrison on serpentine and other plants, Eldridge Moores, a real pioneer in plate tectonics, and Peter will mention that a little bit later, and Chad Roberts discussing conservation biology and ecological processes, and Chad did the work on fire to provide us that information. The Berryessa region, named for Berryessa Peak, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's in this piece in here, is located at the southern end of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. And the yellow area is the area of this guide, and the red area is the National Monument. It is within 50 to 100 miles from both Sacramento and the Bay Area metropolitan area. So a lot of people can come here and visit this place. We hope this book will help them enjoy it and be able to interpret it. This is a map of the National Monument. The southern end is down here where Stebbins Coal Canyon Reserve is located. And you know, there's a lot of science for the people that worked, a lot of people that worked on the designation of the monument. And there's a lot of science involved with the National Lands Conservation System. And we have that in this area. And we have like the three Stebbins Coal Canyon Reserve, Quail Ridge, and further north is the McLaughlin Reserve up in here that are part of that science. And then there's areas of critical environmental concern on the BLM lands, and there is research and natural areas on the Mendocino National Forest. So the yellow is BLM, and the north is the Mendocino National Forest. What's interesting here, and there's other pictures in the book, I think, are there, aside from the National Monument, which is only federal public lands, there are many areas that are protected private lands, and those continue to be protected with conservation easements. Most recently, the Gun Ranch was protected by the Napa Land Trust. That was 53,000 acres. The monument and these protected lands encompass probably 1 million acres. And I mentioned the wilderness areas, the Cedar Ruffs, Cache Creek, and Snow Mountain, and up here abutting the monument is the Yuki Wilderness. This is the map of the fire areas. I just put in, we have different maps in the area. Some show the Native American illustrations. There's the cultural history, Mexican land grants, and more. I like this, it's just amazing. I mean, we all maybe remember in this region the county fire that burned all of the Blue Ridge on both sides in 2018, but there's just been in this area in particular, which are mostly human ignited, overlapping fires that occur in this region And this map's now outdated because right here was a very recent fire. That was within a month, I think, that one occurred. So we'll get to that. It's a dynamic and evolving landscape. It's being affected by climate change. It's now increasing aridity and moisture deprivation, and that's going to really affect how we manage and think about this region. So that's all I have. One of my favorite rocks is serpentine. It's green, it's sort of slick-sided. Actually, it's serpentinite is the name of the rock. The soils and the plants are serpentine. Peter, I'll just say, is a professor and emeritus and research geologist emeritus in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UC Davis. He was a colleague of Eldridge for many, many years, and they did a lot of trips together. So Eldridge's passing has been hard on us, but it did inspire this book. So I hope you all enjoy it. Peter?
Okay. So as Bob just told you, Eldridge Moores was the inspiration for this book, and he was my revered colleague at UC Davis for over 35 years. And in June of 2016, as you can see here on the left, the department held a celebration which brought together a lot of his former students and friends, and we had a wonderful time. And I know Eldridge really, it meant a lot to him. It was 50 years in the Department of Earth Sciences, or first geology. And Eldridge was one of the leading proponents of plate tectonics. He came, matured as a geologist during the time when it was just coming into fruition. And plate tectonics really started, if you will, with the idea of Alfred Wegener, who probably many of you have heard his name. He was a German scientist, and in 1915 he published a book, saying that the North America, Europe, Africa, and South America had all been part of a large continent at one time, and he based this on things like fossil evidence, but he had no mechanism. At the time, geologists had no idea that there could be such a thing as why would continents drift. And it took another 50 years or so till Eldridge's mentor at Princeton University, a guy named Harry Hess, who's a really interesting guy, influenced Eldridge in many ways. But one of the things he was a commander of transport ship in the Pacific during World War II, and he was assigned, amongst other things, to look for evidence for where U-boats might be hanging out, German submarines, and using newfound sonar echoing techniques. And he realized he could use it basically to map the seafloor, see things the topography of the seafloor that no one had ever seen. He discovered the mid-ocean ridges, the trenches in the Pacific, seamounts, large volcanoes on the ocean floor. And all these discoveries led him to kind of conclude in the early 60s that there was some kind of a process where the plates, as they were being nascently called, were formed at mid-ocean ridges and then consumed or subducted, recycled in the trenches. And that was a profound thing that led Eldridge, moved him on. And Eldridge met a guy named Fred Vine, also at Princeton, and who was a young assistant professor there. And they went on to do incredible work on ophiolites. I'll talk about that in a bit. Ophiolites are bits of fossil ocean crust formed at spreading centers. So in the next 12 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick primer on plate tectonics. I hope most of you know this stuff. If not, it's going to be kind of very fast, and so I apologize for this. But basically, this is a map of the plates as we exist today. And the only thing I really wanted to point out is here in Northern California, we are in a unique spot. Well, there are other unique spots on Earth, but here for our purposes, we're close to the boundary of three plates. That is, we have the North American plate, we have the Pacific plate, and then we have the small plate that's sort of rapidly disappearing under the Cascades, called the Juan de Fuca, and the southern end is called the Gorda Ridge. And that makes it a very special place for geology, and it really affected the way the underlying geology of the Berryessa region was formed. So quickly, there are three types of plate boundaries, and they're all really close to here. One is the place that is the main story of the Berryessa region for many millions of years, and that's the convergent plate boundary, where one plate basically is subducted beneath another. Out in the oceans, we have divergent plate boundaries where plates are spreading apart and extending, and new plates are formed. And then, of course, we have our local plate boundary, the transform or boundary, where we have the so-called strike slip fault, our local fault, San Andreas, and its subsidiary fault. So I'm briefly going to talk about these three boundaries and kind of how they became important, how they're important for the formation of the underlying geology here. So the divergent plate boundaries, once again, are the places where new crust is formed, oceanic crust generally in the oceans, or at least may start on land, but they eventually always wind up being in the oceans. Magmas rise from depth and they are erupted on the surface. One of the telltale types of lavas that are produced are these pillow shapes. Mark's going to show you some examples of that you can see on our field trip. There are magmas that don't make it to the surface, they cool slowly and they form other kinds of bodies. And then beneath it all is the underlying mantle where these magmas came from. And they are very interesting. The mantle rock called peridotite is when hydrated and metamorphosed becomes the state rock of California, serpentinite, which you will see a lot of in the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. And we know through drilling of the ocean crust in a few places that's the case. We can see all these layers, but we also know through the seismic properties that are shown here that the seismic properties of the ocean crust correspond to these different rock types. And briefly, this is a picture of what a really good outcrop looks like. Eldridge and I worked for many years in the 80s in a place in Cyprus called the Troodos ophiolite complex. And I should point out that the word ophiolite is basically fossil ocean crust that has been emplaced on land through tectonic processes, and they're found all over the world, even here in California, within our field area. This is an example of the boundary between so-called sheeted dikes, which are shown here. They're rotated, and the underlying gabbros, and this is in Troodos Mountains of Cyprus, and there is Professor Moores with his graduate students, some of them very esteemed geologists today. So that was the quick thing on divergent plate boundaries. For something like from about 175 to 25 million years ago, where we are now was in a convergent zone. That is where the Pacific plate, which was called the Farallon plate, now it's gone, was being subducted under the western margin of North America. And a couple of important points I want to point out here is there's metamorphism associated with it. When you take this bit of the ocean plate and you put it down deep into the Earth's asthenosphere, it heats up slowly, but it undergoes some unusual metamorphism, that it's rocks that are metamorphosed at basically lower temperatures than they would be normally, but at very high pressures. And they give you these unusual rocks that Mark's going to show you a picture of, blue schists and eclogites that we find within the Franciscan formation, for the Franciscan complex here. And the other thing that happens is the downgoing slab also dehydrates, the fluids come up, they lower the melting point here in this overlying part of the asthenosphere, causes magmas to rise. You get a volcanic arc like is happening today in the Cascades, but happened for something like 150 million years ago. These were the ancestral Sierra Nevada. That arc is long gone now, but the sediments that were shed off it came down into basically ocean basins in front of it, the so-called forearc of the Sierra Nevada arc. And they are that's what's left. And we call that the Great Valley group of sediments, shales and sandstones. The stuff that was going down in the trench gets recycled, and that is the so-called Franciscan complex that I'm going to talk about in a bit. Okay, and this is a kind of a paleogeographic reconstruction of what that might have looked like during that period where there was an ancestral Sierra Nevada volcanic arc. Underlying this basin in front of it, this so-called forearc basin, where all the sediments that, as this arc eroded and basically all the sediments came down in various kinds of submarine type deposits, it became what we have now is called the Great Valley group from those sediments. And underneath that is this bit of an ophiolite, a bit of fossil ocean crust that was in place at about 160 million years ago. And you can see bits of that also in our field guide. And then of course, further west outboard where that subduction complex was happening is this so-called mixture of rocks that got recycled in this subduction zone, and we call that now the Franciscan complex. And this is kind of this is another graphic from our book that sort of shows a conceptual model of what was going on. We had this Farallon plate being subducted for something like 150 million years. And these ocean plates carried terrains on them, ocean terrains, big seamounts, and they try to go down this big trench, this big subduction zone. Many of them can't make it. They get sheared off, get reincorporated. Snow Mountain itself is an example of one of these big oceanic seamount volcanoes that got caught up and brought back to the surface. And that's really some interesting thing. One other really cool feature is something that we've discovered about modern subduction zones, and that is fluids coming off this descending slab basically find their way to the surface and erupt on the surface of the ocean floor as what we call mud volcanoes. And this is known from studies in the Marianas Trench, where we see these large, really large, they're essentially seamounts, but they're made out of serpentinite mud and blocks of rock. And we think we have fossil analogs of those here in the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. Okay, so I said that subduction went till about 25 million years ago. At about 28 million years ago, this spreading center that was basically creating the Pacific Plate and the Farallon Plate, it intersected the trench, basically. And when that happened, the boundary between North America and the Farallon Plate became a transform boundary. Basically, it was the initiation of the San Andreas Fault. And that thing has grown over the last 28 million years to the present configuration where this so-called triple junction I was referring to earlier between the Pacific Plate, North American Plate, and the Gorda Plate here now lies just a few hundred miles north of us here from Davis anyway. Some of you may be very even closer. One other really interesting effect of that form of subducting a hot ocean ridge is that it creates volcanism underneath the plate where it's being under the North American Plate. And this diagram shows basically on the horizontal axis, the distance from the Mendocino triple junction I just referred to in kilometers versus the age of the volcanic rocks that were produced. And if you look here, the oldest are about 28 million years ago, and they are, many of you have seen Morro Rock. It's a big hunk of it's a big volcanic rock down in central California. And you can go all the way up into our area here where you have both Sonoma volcanics, which Mark will show you a picture of above Pope Valley, and the youngest, some of the youngest rocks in the Clear Lake volcanic system are like 15,000-year-old cinder cones. So basically, we still had that subducting mid-ocean ridge basically under Northern California. It's really quite cool. One other thing besides volcanism is hydrothermal activity. Hydrothermal activity drove basically ore deposits. For example, the McLaughlin mine up in Knoxville was driven by that same subducting slab, mid-ocean ridge, as well as many of the mercury deposits that we find in the Coast Ranges, including up at Wilbur Springs, which Mark will show you a picture of too. And now we have the strike slip boundary. But not all of the stress between the two plates is basically going in the strike slip motion. So look at these two figures. On the right here is a figure that shows GPS stations and their relative motion. And there are all the motions here, and you can see they're in either inches or centimeters a year, and generally on the order of a centimeter or two or less, relative to a station here between the Calaveras and the San Andreas Fault here, this station here on this diagram on the right. And you can see the standard thing, so-called right lateral strike slip type motion. That is, the North American Plate is moving to the right relative to the Pacific Plate. But if you look at it from a different perspective, because plate motions are relative to some fixed point, if you look at the motions of these same stations relative to some point in the center of the North American continent, then you see somewhat of a different picture. Sure, close to the San Andreas Fault, everything is moving to the northwest, parallel to the fault. But if you look here, so getting out into the San Joaquin or Central Valley, you can see there's a very westward motion of North America. That means that there is some component of compression where North America is sort of shoving itself against this Pacific Plate. That means that not all of the stress is taken up in this lateral motion along the San Andreas Fault. So what does that mean? What that means is that there is some expression of this compression. This is a diagram, we call it a geologic cross-section. I know for some of you this could be kind of a little scary, but basically if we go, this is taken on a line at a latitude somewhat like near going through Lake Berryessa, if you will. You have the San Andreas Fault here, right? It's right lateral. That means that this little cross means that that the selenium block is moving north relative to the other side of the fault, right? And once we cross that fault, we're into this big, basically fossil convergent margin that existed for something like 150 million years. Here's the Franciscan Formation, here's the Great Valley, and here's the ophiolite underneath it. And then what we see, though, is an expression of this convergence. So we have a bunch of strike slip faults like the Calaveras and the Napa Fault, right? Recent earthquake on the Napa Fault just a few years ago, right? But then there are other faults. Here's the Green Valley Fault that cuts through near Fairfield. We have a bunch of faults. Most of them we can't see on the surface, and they're kind of dotted because we don't really know exactly where they are, but we know that these are what we call thrust faults or reverse faults. They're basically, the rocks are folding through compression as the North American plate is shoving up this way against the Pacific plate and is causing deformation and folding within the Great Valley and the Franciscan Formation. And basically, what does that mean? It means we've got earthquakes. We have, for example, the earthquakes that happened in 1892 in winters. Those were pretty severe earthquakes for the part of the world that we live here in the Sacramento Valley. And as the hills are rising, and elders always love to point out on field trips that you could see, the hills rising just outside of west of Davis, that you have creeks and rivers like Pewter Creek, which are antecedent, mean they continue to flow in the same direction even as the hills rose around them. They just kept down cutting through there. And also this compression is driving fluids out of the rocks at depth. And that's the reason we have, for example, natural gas wells here, but also because we have a lot of alkali springs in the Coast Ranges that they're coming out, way above the water table because they're being driven by pore fluids that are pore pressures that are a result of this compression. And Etna Springs is a good example of that. Mark will show you a picture of that as well. So I know I had to rush through all this, and I apologize for making it oversimplified. It's very complex geology, but it's really exciting geology, and I hope you take the time to go out and look at these things. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Peter. So there was one question that I think is a really good one because you admitted yourself that this is complicated, but the viewer asked, is there a way to break this down? Like, how do I learn more in simpler terms about this geology? And I'll start by saying there's a great 6 pages in your book, but
Yeah.
do you have any other suggestions?
No, that, take an introduction geology class at your local community college too. No, but I have to say that the chapters, and I really want to give kudos to my co-author, Mark, because Mark did a beautiful job of trying to knocking up the basic geology, and I was trying to make it complicated all the time. But I think people will find very readable basic geology there. I had to go through it so fast, and sometimes I make it a little more complicated than it is. But read the book, buy the book. Hold on a second.
And then one from Kirk, he said, could melanges in general be the products of mud volcanoes that disrupt large regions of accretionary wedges?
That's a great question, because before the Marianas discoveries, we didn't even know there was such a thing as mud volcanoes. The melange theory we always thought were tectonic, that these were processes that were occurring right in the subduction zone itself. So how you tell mixed up jumbled rocks in a serpentine matrix, mud matrix that's caused by tectonic melange versus how you can tell from something that came out and formed on the ocean floor and then was covered by sediments, is very difficult to do, I think. So it's a fair question, and honestly, I don't think we know the answer.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so I reiterated in the chat, but if you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A. There's a couple that have come up that we'll answer at the end, or I'll ask at the end. But now I'm going to introduce Mark Hoshofsky, and Mark and I have an amazing amount in common. He grew up in Virginia, as I did, which we just learned, and he studied at Humboldt State. He got an ecology degree. But for his life, he's been a naturalist and conservationist who has worked for the state protecting endangered species. And as you heard, was a major part of this project. And his wife is now happy that he's away from the computer a little bit more because he is married and he has 2 grown sons. So Mark, let's hear what you have to share. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks. Thanks for joining us, everybody, tonight. I just wanted to share some of my motivation for doing this work. I'm retired and living, we all, 3 of us live in Davis, and I wanted to learn more about the local geology because it just seemed really fascinating. And I went on several trips with Eldridge, and I suggested, let's do a road guide. And he was quite willing to help. And he went out with us in the field several times. And we originally thought it was just going to be a 20-page pamphlet, but it certainly got more than that. Peter's giving you a quick overview of the geology. I'm going to provide a virtual tour of part of the route from the Sacramento Valley. Let me show you the route we're going to go. This is Davis and Woodland over here, Fairfield down below, Napa, Sonoma. This is the Napa Valley. I'm going to take you on a little tour from Winters up through.
I'm going to pause you for a second, Mark. I think you need to share your screen.
Sorry?
So go back to the Zoom platform and hit the share screen button.
Oh, sorry. I forgot to do that. Sorry about that. I just clicked on my screen here. Okay, so this is the Sacramento Valley. This is the Napa Valley. We're going to go on a tour. Can you see it now? Okay.
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, from Winters up Poudre Creek Canyon through Monticello Dam, and then up along the west side of Lake Berryessa through Pope Creek Canyon into Pope Valley, and then up to Etna Springs. I'm going to just give you some of the highlights of the geology, the nature, and the history of this area. Primarily, I want to entice you to go out and explore this area and to use the book. The geology, as Peter explained, is really complex. It's been faulted and folded, so it doesn't lay out chronologically as you drive through this landscape. But the text will explain it pretty well, I think. You have both a good overview of what Peter is talking about, and then you have the milepost guides in the back. So to start off just outside of Winters, the Highway 128 enters up Poudre Creek Canyon. And just before you get into the canyon, you'll see some black basalt boulders up on the hillside and down in the creek. These are locally known as the Black Rocks. And these rocks are about 14 to 15 million years old. And they have flowed as hot lava for over 150 miles from the northern Sierra up near Susanville. And it's pretty incredible that it would flow that far without cooling. It's probably the southernmost extent of some of the flood basalts that are up in Oregon and Washington. And a lot of those basalts are driven by migration of North America over a weak spot in the crust that is the Yellowstone hotspot. And as the continent moves across that, the volcanic activity pops up in various locations. Another thing to point out in this area is that by Winters, you're one of the driest parts of the tour. You'll see a lot of grasslands, open blue oak woodland. This area is in the rain shadow of the Coast Range. Most of the storms coming over the mountains will drop their rain on the west slope, then pass over this area until they get to the Sierra, then they drop the rest of their moisture. So this is a dry area. As you get up the canyon a little bit more, you get to Monticello Dam. This is a image of the dam here. This is Lake Berryessa in the foreground. In the far distance, you can see Cedar Ruff's wilderness area. And this is the backside of Lake Berryessa. the route goes up along the west shore of Lake Berryessa. In this area, you'll see these steeply dipping beds here. This is the Great Valley group that Peter described that had been folded in more recent years, well, in the last 60 million years or so. And they were originally ocean floor sediments that were deposited as submarine landslides that pushed this debris down to the abyssal plain over 10,000 feet deep, sometimes up to 10,000 feet deep in the ocean. Now here you get to see them up on land. As you go a little further west, the climate gets moister and the frequency of fog increases. Those of you that may live on the in western Napa County and out towards the coast are used to seeing these long stringy growths from the trees, but they don't occur east of Rag Canyon because there's not enough fog. This is lace lichen. It was originally called Spanish moss by some of the early pioneers in this area because that's what they saw when they crossed over the Panama through Panama on their route to California. But it's not a moss, it's a lichen. It's a partnership between an algae and a fungus. It's not parasitic on the tree, and it is considered California's state lichen. One thing to do as you pass through this area is stop and look at this very closely. The picture on the right shows how intricate this lace texture is. It's just beautiful to stop and look at more carefully. The book also acknowledges the indigenous people that have lived here for thousands of years. We have sidebars about the Patwin and the Lake Miwok people. Most of this guide passes through historic Patwin lands. The Patwin lived on the southwest side of the Sacramento Valley and up into the foothills. They're now known as the Yochadihe Awinchun Nation. And they have a fairly diversified economy now with a casino, some 20,000 acres of farm and ranch land in Capay Valley, commercial brand of wine and olive oil and honey. The Lake Miwok people live up in Upper Puda Creek and Lower Lake. The route passes through Pope Valley, which has the southernmost locations of Lake Miwok villages. The Lake Miwok now live at the Middletown Rancheria. They have they're diversifying their economy as well, having a casino and a brewing company. As you get along the west shore of Lake Berryessa and to the areas to the west, you begin to see outcrops of this Franciscan complex, this melange. Melange is just simply a French word for mixture. And as Peter described, this was really sort of just scraped off of the ocean, the descending ocean slab. It has a lot of really interesting oceanic sediments. In the upper left, you'll see as a picture of ribbon cherts. These are the remains of planktonic animals that had quartz-rich skeletons. And as they died, there was this constant rain of their skeletons to the sea floor and eventually built up to become chert. And the ribbon nature of it has been from the folding that happened afterwards. On the right is an example of ocean pillow basalts. This is when the basalt comes up from, erupts into ocean water, freezing ocean water or cold ocean water, and it forms a pillow-like structure as it cools very quickly. Down in the lower left, you'll see large blocks of old volcanic rock. This is Rainy Rock near Muscovite Corner. These are chunks of